Right now, there is a number you have never looked up. It sets your mortgage rate. It determines what your savings account pays. It decides whether the government can afford to keep spending or has to cut. It moves stock markets. It reshapes entire economies. It has triggered 4 major financial crises in the last 30 years, and most people have never heard of it. This is how the bond market works. And why? If you don't understand it, you don't understand money. What a bond actually is. A bond is a loan. That's it. You lend money to a government or company. They promise to pay you back in full on a specific date, called the maturity. And while you wait, they pay you interest along the way, called the coupon. The US government issues them, companies issue them, cities issue them, and every day trillions of dollars worth of these IOUs change hands on a market most people have never opened. The global bond market is $133 trillion. That is larger than the entire global stock market. But here is where it gets interesting, and where most explanations stop too early. Bond prices and interest rates move in opposite directions, always. This is not optional, it is math. When interest rates rise, existing bonds, the ones paying the old lower rate, become less valuable. Their price falls. When rates fall, those same bonds, now paying above market rates, become more attractive. Their price rises. This is the engine under everything, and it runs whether you know about it or not. Why bonds set your mortgage rate. Here is the part nobody explains at the kitchen table. The 10-year U.S. Treasury bond yield is the most important interest rate in the world. When you apply for a mortgage, the bank is not making up a number. They take the 10-year Treasury yield right now, approximately 4.48%, and they add a margin of roughly 2 to 2.5% on top. That is your mortgage rate. In 2021, the 10-year yield was 0.9%. Average mortgage rates, 2.8%. Cheap money. Booming housing market. By 2023, the 10-year yield hit 5%. Mortgage rates hit 7.8%. Same house, same neighborhood. Monthly payment, roughly 65% higher. Nobody changed the house. The bond market changed the price of money. The same logic applies to car loans, credit cards, student debt, business loans. Every interest rate you have ever paid has a bond yield behind it. Most people just never saw the thread.
The Fed, the lever, and why the whole world watches bonds. The Federal Reserve is the lever. Their job? Control inflation without wrecking the economy. The main tool? Raising or cutting the federal funds rate, which ripples through bond yields, and from there, into every other interest rate. When inflation spiked in 2022, the Fed raised rates 11 times in 16 months, 0 to 5.5%, the fastest rate cycle in 40 years. Bond yields followed upward. Mortgages followed. Business borrowing costs followed. The entire economy repriced. And here is the part that confuses people. None of this is theoretical. It happened to you. If you bought a house after 2022, you felt it. If you carry a balance on a credit card, you felt it. If you have a car payment, you felt it. The bond market did not stay on Wall Street. It moved into your driveway and your kitchen table. The world watches the 10-year Treasury yield because every central bank, every bond market, every currency, every investment strategy is calibrated off that one number. When it moves, everything adjusts. What happened in 2022? Here is the thing most financial news never said out loud. 2022 was the worst year for bonds in 100 years. Long-term bond indexes fell approximately 30%. The S&P 500, which everyone was watching, fell 19%. The safe thing fell harder than the risky thing. Why? Because the Fed had kept rates near zero for over a decade. Bonds issued at 1, 1.5, 2% looked fine when rates stayed low. Then inflation hit. The Fed moved fast, and every bond issued at the old low rates got repriced downward overnight. People who were told bonds were safe found their bond funds down 20, 25, 30%. Retirement accounts built around fixed income took hits that equity-heavy portfolios sometimes didn't. The 2022 bond crash is the reason this matters.
Bonds are not automatically safe. They are safe or risky depending on what rates do, and rates depend on the bond market.
How governments use bonds and why it matters. The U.S. government has $36 trillion in debt. Every dollar of that debt was borrowed by issuing bonds. And every year, the government has to pay interest on all of it. At a 5% yield, $36 trillion in debt costs roughly $1.8 trillion per year in interest payments alone. That is more than the entire U.S. defense budget every year, just to service the existing debt. When bond yields rise, the government's borrowing becomes more expensive. Programs get squeezed, deficits grow. More bonds get issued, more supply hits the market. Yields can rise further. This is why bond yields are a national policy question, not just a trader statistic. And it is not just America. Japan, China, Germany, the UK, every major economy runs on this same mechanism. They issue bonds, they pay yields, they watch the US Treasury market because it sets the baseline for everything else. Where bonds stand today. Today, the 10-year Treasury yield sits at approximately 4.48%. That is the number setting your mortgage, your savings rate, your credit card floor. It came down from its 2023 peak near 5%, but it has not returned to the near-zero world of 2020 and 2021. The Federal Reserve has cut rates modestly from its peak, with the funds rate at 4.25 to 4.5%. But inflation has not fully surrendered. The Fed is holding. Markets are watching two things. First, whether inflation data allows further cuts, which would bring yields and mortgage rates down. Second, whether U.S. debt levels force yields higher regardless of what the Fed does, because the government keeps issuing bonds and the world keeps having to absorb them. Nobody knows which force wins. The range of analyst predictions for where the 10-year yield lands by end of 2026 spans from 3.5 to 5.5%. That is not analysis. That is a confession that the bond market is genuinely uncertain right now.
What this means for you. 3 things to take from this. First, every interest rate you pay, mortgage, car, credit card, student loan, has a bond yield at the root. That yield is public information. The 10-year Treasury yield is reported daily. You can look it up in 30 seconds. Once you know it, every rate quote you receive will make sense in a way it didn't before. Second, the Federal Reserve meets 8 times per year. The next meeting is the most important financial event in your calendar that you are probably not tracking. When they speak about rate direction, they are speaking directly to your borrowing costs, your savings returns, and your investment portfolio. Third, bonds are not the opposite of investing. They are the infrastructure that investing runs on. Understanding them does not make your portfolio boring. It makes every other financial decision you make more precise. The money markup exists for one reason, to show you the gap between the headline and the reality. The headline says, Fed holds rates steady. The reality, bond yields moved. Your mortgage is $180 a month more expensive than it was 2 years ago, and you didn't know why until right now. Subscribe, and we will go through the next one together.